And I know that I tease sometimes about difficult gospel readings and difficult sermons to write, but this gospel reading really ranks pretty high as readings I wish weren't in the Bible and readings I really wish weren't in the lectionary. Because today's gospel reading drops us right into the middle of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and it drops us right into a really awkward moment where Jesus is talking about some truly difficult things. We're going to talk about these difficult things in a few minutes. But first, we have to begin at the beginning. And by this, I mean we have to start with the beginning of this sermon that Jesus is preaching. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 is Jesus' first big teaching moment in this gospel. He channels Moses, who went up the mountain to receive the law of God, and we hear that Jesus goes up a mountain and there with his disciples begins to teach them. The Sermon on the Mount begins with something very familiar and famous, the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the pure in heart, and so forth. It's really important today to remember that Jesus begins his sermon with blessings. He blesses those who feel broken and beaten down. He blesses those who long for a world at peace. He blesses those who have known pain and fear and suffering. And so when we get to the hard stuff in today's gospel, we have to hear it in this context of God's love and blessing already poured out upon those who have been hurt, trampled, and betrayed by the careless or malicious actions of others. Yes, Jesus begins his sermon by speaking blessing to those who follow him and who seek his wisdom. And through the blessings that he gives, Jesus empowers his hearers to become blessings for the world. In the next part of his sermon, he calls his followers salt and light. He tells them to shine brightly in the world that all may see the goodness of God through them. In other words, Jesus says that all who live in blessed relationship with God reveal God through how they behave in the world. Jesus isn't saying anything new here. The law that Moses received on Mount Sinai are those commandments that God gave to the Israelites for the sake of their health and their well-being. And these commandments were also a way of preserving the distinctiveness of God's people in a landscape of competing religions, gods, and values. The way that the nations would know which God they served was by watching how they lived. The beauty of the way that the commandments functioned for the ancient Israelites and onward into modern-day Jewish practice is that the commandments are intended to provide a seamless relationship between what you believe and how you live. Your behavior and beliefs inform each other. Align your behavior according to God's commandments, and bit by bit, your heart will become more aligned with the heart of God. When Jesus comes to earth, he comes in part to show us what it looks like when your heart is perfectly aligned with the heart of God and when your life perfectly reflects the grace and blessing that God has given you. This is how Jesus lives, and this is why Jesus talks about himself not as the one who will abolish or get rid of the law, but as the one who fulfills the law. He is the one who reveals the heart of the law. He is the one who distills the commandments into their most essential parts. And the essential heart of God's commandments is love. Later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus will give up on trying to explain individual commandments, and he will instead collapse all 500-some commandments into just 2. Love God with all you've got, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love fulfills the law, and Jesus shows us what that looks like. He is the perfect embodiment of love that seeks justice, love that heals, love that extends grace, love that shows mercy, love that sacrifices itself, and love that even defeats the power of death. Jesus stands among us to tell us that love transforms hearts and love will transform the world. And this is what today's gospel reading is all about when we peel back all the layers. Jesus takes a handful of commandments today, and for each one he says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Using all of these big, uncomfortable things as examples, Jesus makes a bigger point, that God's love leads us to be concerned and cautious with how our actions and attitudes affect others. He asks us to consider making small decisions by love, and that these small decisions add up to bigger things grounded in love. He also warns us how small things done with spite or malice contribute to great acts of injustice and systems of harm. Jesus isn't talking in today's gospel about what will save your soul for all eternity, and he isn't pretending that we can do any of this apart from God's grace, or that we can do this perfectly, or that we can somehow live above our need for mercy and forgiveness and divine hope. But Jesus is talking about how we are called to live a distinct life of faith in the world. He's talking about the ethics that we embrace in faith, and he's talking about how our faith in God demands that we make choices, big and small, based on how faithfully our actions show love for God and for neighbor. To quote a pastor friend of mine, Jesus was all about communal responsibility, and love is about living as God's blessed and beloved community in this world. So this means that we can't just be concerned about the big things. We have to be concerned with the small things behind the things. In today's gospel, Jesus tells us that we are to warn against unchecked anger and self-centeredness, objectification of others, microaggressions, carelessness and indifference in our relationships, resentment, spite, manipulation. These are not the ways that faith calls us to live. These are not the things of God's heart, and these are not revelations of God's love. And so here we are, and we might as well address that big ol' elephant in the sanctuary. No, Jesus wasn't talking about modern-day divorce in this passage today. Jesus was criticizing a system among systems where the one with the power in the relationship could simply dissolve it with no obligation to make provision or to preserve the dignity of the other. Jesus is challenging callous dismissiveness within the patriarchy and not making a moral judgment for our modern time, even though this passage has too often been weaponized as if he were. Jesus in this gospel teaches us that every commandment that God has given at its heart reveals God's concern for the dignity, health, and wholeness of one another. Jesus teaches us that love is the foundation upon which all other concerns of faithfulness are built. And if we live by love, then we shouldn't need the commandments to tell us what to do. Following Jesus means that our hearts will simply be trained in love to live love in the world. Because for Jesus, every decision that we make, big or small, is an opportunity to exercise the power of God's love. Jesus asks us to be loving in the way that we talk to each other and think about each other, to be loving in our attitudes and not just in our actions. Jesus challenges us to use our power and our privilege when we have it for the sake of generosity and goodness, because this is how love works. It doesn't seek the bare minimum in how we relate to one another in the world. Love seeks the max. It demands everything, and it transforms everything. Mother Teresa is once quoted to have said, "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." Small things done with great love. This is how Jesus calls us to live in the world. This is how Jesus teaches us to relate to our neighbors and to our enemies and to those whom we don't like or can't understand. Small acts of love are how we are called to enter into our political conversations. Small acts of love are how we might transform our political landscape. Small acts of love are how we care for our creation, little bit by little bit, as we are able in the face of a giant climate crisis. Small acts of love affect the attitudes we have toward those drivers who cut us off, and those customers who are rude to us, and the neighbors who wear us out with their needs. Small acts of love drive us to think twice about telling that off-color joke or making that slur or sharing that gossip. And even if it doesn't feel like it, these small acts of love really will transform hearts and transform the world. Friends, this is the call and the promise in today's gospel and in the whole of the Sermon on the Mount. When we were lost, broken, fearful, despised, God is the voice that spoke love and blessing to us, gave us our dignity, gave us back our lives. We have been blessed by the grace and the love of God. And so even when we do not have the power to do all the big things, we can and are called to do all the small things with God's great love. And our small acts of love, done over and over again, will change everything. Amen.